Perfect. Well, firstly, thank you all for joining, and welcome to our ninth SuperWomen in Tech webinar. So if you're new here, SuperWomen in Tech is a community focused on creating awareness and opportunities for underrepresented tech talent by addressing topics and challenges within the tech industry. And if you have been here before, then welcome back. My name is Gemma, and I'm a senior consultant at Source Group International. So our session today will be focused on neurodiversity in the tech industry, and we are joined by our incredible guest, who is an extremely well-established leader within technology, also a published author and a neurodivergent tech professional with an inspiring journey and wealth of knowledge leading the keynote today. Just before we get started, I'm going to touch on a few housekeeping parts. So this webinar is part of our Source Talks community and is produced by Source Group International. We are an international staff and solution provider. We discover technology talent for forward-thinking organizations. If there's anyone in the session today who's looking for a new role or actually looking for people within their tech team, just drop us a note in the chat or also visit our website, and we would love to hear from you. There will be an opportunity to ask our guests some questions at the end of the session. So if you could all just pop your questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of the webinar here. We'll touch base on these after the presentation, and hopefully we can answer as many as we can. So Meri, it's an absolute pleasure having you with us today. I'm going to hand this over to you now to introduce yourself, and so we can get going.
Awesome. First question, can everybody see my slides okay? I'm going to assume yes, unless somebody tells me no. All good. So hi, everybody. Pleasure to be here today at SuperWomen in Tech. And yeah, I'm going to talk today about neurodiversity and inclusion. But a brief intro from me. I'm South African originally. I grew up in South Africa, and one of my weird early life achievements is I built part of South Africa's first satellite, which is what this image on the bottom left here is, as a teenager. So I have great parenting advice, which is don't let your kids do anything cool when they're young, because I soldered something that went into space when I was 16, and it's all just been downhill since then, because I can never be as cool as that gawky 16-year-old was. But I've had a long and varied career. I started at Procter & Gamble and spent my first 10 years there, then left and joined the Government Digital Service. So I built the team that built Gov.uk, which included scaling them from 30 to 300 people in 9 months, which was quite extreme and not something I'd recommend anybody to do. And then not long after that, moved into CTO roles. So I was CTO for M&S.com, for Moo, then for Monzo, then for Helix, which is AI-driven drug discovery. And these days I'm at Pleo. I also do a bunch of other stuff, including I run a technology leadership conference called Lead Dev. The next edition is coming up in Berlin on the 4th and 5th of November. So if you have any engineering managers or tech leads or senior engineers in your network that you think could benefit from some leadership training, then please do recommend it to them. But I'm going to start here by admitting something to you, which is that unfortunately I'm the one the Daily Mail warns you about. I'm a woman who's non-binary and I'm working in tech. I'm gay, I'm foreign, I'm employed, which seems to be a bad thing because I'm foreign. I'm disabled physically, I'm neurodiverse, I've got ADHD and autism, I'm godless, and my wife is British, so I'm over here stealing your women and your jobs. But I grew up hugely aware of the kind of unasked and undeserved privilege that I had growing up white in apartheid South Africa. So my childhood was full of these horrendous signs that basically just say toilets and beaches and buses and everything was whites only. You weren't allowed on the beach, you weren't allowed in the bathroom. Unless you were white. And that was something that I didn't particularly have any part in, but I still benefited from it, despite the fact that I disagreed with it in a very extreme way, right? And so denying that privilege, denying the fact that I got better educational opportunities, I got better life opportunities, isn't really helpful. And I think sometimes people get very frustrated or very angry about being told that they're privileged. But I think being told that you're privileged is telling you that some things are easier for you. Doesn't mean they're easy, just means they're easier. And so I think the most useful thing we can all do is to assess and understand and acknowledge the privilege that we've got. I went to school with people who, like girls who genuinely, their marks were better in the summertime because they were doing their homework by candlelight in the wintertime. I promise you that none of us who had electricity were thinking, the privilege of this light switch every time we switch the light on to do our maths homework, right? And so today we're mostly going to talk about neurodiversity, but I think it's worth knowing that there are some really good resources out there to understand some of this stuff better. I'll share the slides afterwards so you can get all the links to the different tools and things. But one example is this from Peggy McIntosh, which is kind of a list of things that we don't realize are benefiting us when we're white in the world. And in the tech community and in the tech industry, we have a particular problem that we have a over-belief in meritocracy. We believe that nobody cares about who we are or what we are, and it's all just about the work. And however much evidence there is that it's not all just about the work, there are some people who cling to that belief because it feeds their egos a bit that they've always done well, and they believe that that's because they're the best rather than because things were loaded in their favor. I think you've probably all seen this image of the difference between equality and equity before, that, you know, if you treat everybody the same, but the starting point is different, then the outcome isn't equal for everybody. Whereas sometimes you have to treat people differently because their situation is different in order to achieve equal outcomes, in order to achieve equity. And not discriminating is important, right? Like, it's a fucking legal requirement, if nothing else. But I think tolerance is the wrong thing to aim for. My little brother kind of hates me, but he tolerates me because we're related. Tolerating someone is like putting up with them despite who they are. I don't think any of us want to be put up with at work despite who we are. And so I think aiming for a much more fully inclusive environment is much better. And so don't just think of inclusion as a binary state where, you know, you're either a horrible, you know, racist and homophobe, or you're actively inclusive. There's a lot of like space between those two perspectives, right? And, you know, tolerance is somewhere along the way, indifference is somewhere along the way. But even if you're not, you know, actively racist, actively homophobic, actively sexist, then you still might be treating people subtly differently. And that's a thing we call microaggressions, right? And so an example of a microaggression is telling young boys that they're very smart, but telling young girls they're very pretty, emphasizing the difference that you see and the difference in what you think is important for people. It's also things like people of color being asked where they're really from, or people talking about your English being good and assuming that it's not your first language because of the way that you look, and those kind of things. And I think the fact that you're all here at a webinar about how to be more inclusive of neurodiverse people means that you probably already care, but just in case you don't, the reason to care about all of this is that diverse teams outperform homogenous teams. Diverse teams win. If you've got a healthy balance of men and women, you're 15% more likely to outperform your competitors. If you have a range of ethnic backgrounds, then you're 35% more likely to beat your competitors. You're more likely to create a significant patent if you have a diverse team. You are more likely to solve difficult problems well if you have women in your team. Industry background, country of origin, career path, gender, all of these make a significant improvement to the effectiveness of teams. Academic background and age, there's less, or in fact a negative significant relationship, which is an interesting side point that we could debate for a while, and I'm very happy to take questions on. But there's just a lot of evidence that if you want a high-performing team that's innovative, that's agile, that exceeds financial targets, that wins, then you need that team to be pretty diverse. And it pays off in the hard results. It pays off at the bottom line. And increasingly, we're finding that people who are entering the workforce and, you know, millennials and Gen Z care a lot about whether an organization is good at equality and inclusion when they're deciding where to join and where to stay and where to get promoted and whether to leave. And I'm just gonna, so not only do diverse teams win, but homogenous teams lose. So if you have very undiverse teams, they are much more likely to be problematic. despite that, there's still a lot of people who are different in some way who find that it negatively affects their career. And to speak to our theme today, those with neurodivergence are the most likely to say that their career has been negatively affected by the fact that their brain is a bit different and works a bit differently. But inclusion is difficult. This is not better because it's easy. This is better because it's hard. So it's the point of the whole thing is that you have a bunch of people with different perspectives, different backgrounds, different experiences, and them coming together, looking at the data and deciding what the right thing to do is. That's what makes it more effective, more efficient, more innovative, more collaborative. And so don't imagine that when you add people who are different to your team, it's going to get easier. It's probably going to get harder for a time, but the kind of pot of gold at the end of the rainbow is very worth having, which is higher performance and innovation and agility. And so we need to not just add diversity, so people who are different, but we have to show inclusive behaviors, make sure that there's strong leadership that shows those behaviors, and that there's balanced diversity so that you've got, you don't end up with camps up against each other. And one of the reasons that this matters so much is that you can waste a lot of energy pretending to be something that you're not. Stonewall did some research on this a few years ago. This is LGBT inclusion, and basically found that if you could be yourself at work, you could be up to 40% more productive. And people of color talk about this as well, that there's an energy drain from needing to code switch or to pass in white-dominated environments. And if you talk to people who've got autism or ADHD or bipolar or any of the various aspects of neurodiversity, from dyslexia and dyspraxia through to autism and ADHD, there's a lot of effort needed to mask, to pretend to be neurotypical and to interact the way that neurotypical people like to interact. And so what do we do about that? This, I appreciate, has been quite depressing till now, but there are some solutions here. And we need to stop allowing underprivileged groups to be pushed away and then start actively building inclusive environments. And I appreciate that that sounds far too easy. And I think conceptually it's easy, but practically it's hard. And so this is a framework that I've used in a number of organizations, which just helps you to think about the different ways that you need to be inclusive. I think people are asking these three questions, whether they do it consciously or subconsciously. They're asking, am I expected here? Is someone like me even expected to apply to this place? And they get an answer to that question based on your website and materials and your job specs and all the information you have about your company or your organization out in the world, right? They're also asking, am I going to be respected here? And that's a question of whether the differences that they have are going to be seen as features or bugs. Is a difference something to be glossed over or minimized, or is it something to be celebrated and benefited from? And then the last question, but the most important one that everybody's asking themselves is, can I be myself and be successful here? Am I able to be who I am and be able to succeed? Or do I have to spend a lot of time and energy pretending to be something I'm not in order to do well here? And so think about it. Think about that. Am I expected here? You know, that's from the outside. Think about your company website, your jobs, your company events, visible employees, what benefits you've got, all of that kind of stuff. And audit those externally facing materials and think about them from the perspective of people with neurodiversity. So you got to remember that if you seem like an organization that won't be positive for people who are neurodiverse, you will never know that they're not applying because you don't see the applications people don't make, right? And so I'd encourage you all to go and look at the materials that you have about your organization and your company or your team and figure out what messages it's sending. The number of people who come to me, startups who come to me in London and are like, we just don't understand why no women engineers will apply to us. And I look at their website and the only benefits they list are, you know, foosball and beer Wednesdays. And then I'm like, is it really that surprising that you don't have anybody different applying here? It sounds like a college frat room, kids, right? And so think about that kind of external perspective. one thing that's really worth doing is reviewing your job specs to check that you're not selecting for arrogance. There's a stat that women will only apply if they meet almost all the requirements. Men apply if they've only met 60% of them. And so in your job specs, put the true must-haves under one heading and move everything else into a nice to have category. If you wouldn't interview someone unless they tick this box, that should be under must-have. Everything else can be somewhere else. And remember that your job specs are about getting people to apply, not about getting people through the interview. And remember that language matters as well. You can use things like Cat Matfield's gender decoder. There's commercial solutions like Textio that you can use. And I think this applies doubly to people who are neurodiverse, is that we tend to be much more literal thinkers. And so if you give us a list of things that have to be true, we're only going to apply if we meet all of them, whatever gender we are. And we're very likely to take it very literally. And so again, be really clear what's must have and what is optional. In terms of, am I respected here? Think about the experience people have when they come and interact with you during your interview process. Think about the recruiters, the interviewers, the employees that they're going to interact with, receptionists, security guards, everybody who's part of that initial experience that they have. One thing that you can do that really helps to debias your interview process is to focus on past performance and real experiences, and to avoid hypotheticals. And again, this helps people who are neurodiverse. We tend to be more literal thinkers, not just autistic folks, ADHD folks as well. For folks who have dyslexia, dyspraxia, etc., if there's any kind of test or exercise that's part of your process, then make it really obvious that you allow extra time if people need it, or use of screen readers if somebody needs to be read to rather than reading themselves, and that kind of stuff. Judge on past performance, not potential. It can be helpful to encourage interviewers to use gender neutral language in their write-ups because it helps spot when people are being biased. And then make sure that whoever runs the decision or debrief is trained to spot and address bias. One thing you can do to help neurodiverse folks as well is to not over-index on eye contact. I know that it's in the neurotypical community very normal to believe that if somebody won't meet your eyes, that they're hiding something. If somebody won't meet your eyes and they're neurodiverse, it might just be that it's very uncomfortable for them to make eye contact. There were some people who I managed earlier in my career who actually helped me realize I was neurodiverse, and I spotted that our one-to-ones went much better if we were on a couch because we were sat side by side and they weren't having to worry about making the right eye contact all the time. And I pointed this out to a couple of them, and their reflection was, this is why with my spouse, we have our best conversations in the car. So think about whether you're putting a lot of pressure on people to make eye contact the way that is normal for neurotypicals. And then think about the interview comms from different perspectives as well. So like, do you let people know about access at your interview locations, about whether there's stairs or lifts and those kind of things? How do you make it clear in advance so somebody's not having to ask for dispensation, but you're very clear that you will grant dispensation in advance, that if somebody's dyslexic or dyspraxic or has dyscalculia, that you're willing to let them have a bit of extra time? How do you make appropriate accommodations for folks who might be fasting for religious reasons or need to pray at specific times? And there's some interesting research that shows that autistic people, if they have a lot of detailed information about what they need to expect, then they're much more likely to perform well at interview and to perform well in the role. And so one of the things that the team at Monzo did when I was there was we created a page that basically said, here's how you travel by public transport to our office. And you're going to come into Liverpool Street, and it's going to be noisy, so remember your noise cancelling headphones. And we're a short walk from there, or you can do this, or you can do that, and just walking people like literally step by step through what it would be like to come to our office, to reduce that fear and that barrier to entry. And then lastly, in terms of whether people can be themselves and be successful, that's actually the most important question. And so you kind of don't have the right to make things better from the external perspective and in the interview process until you've made it through that somebody can be successful without having to expend all this energy hiding or pretending to be something that they're not. And so think about whether somebody can actually succeed if they're different. And I think some of this comes down to whether you have a philosophy of trying to make sure everybody can have the opportunity to do what they do best every day. I think we need to stop pretending that people can all be the same, because we just level people out to kind of consistent mediocrity if we do that. And so we need to get the most out of difference. We're not interchangeable resource units. And if somebody calls you a resource, refer to them as overhead until they stop it. We're colors or flavors. We're better in complement or in concert with each other. I would watch the hell out of a 7 Hulks movie, but I think that the Avengers are much cooler because they're good at different things, right? And so think of it as a matter of casting people into the right roles. How do you get the best out of somebody given what they are brilliant at, given their capabilities? And assemble a great team with complementary abilities, and worry more about how that team looks as a whole than how the individual looks as at an individual level. I don't know if you've all seen this movie. It's Ghostbusters from 2016. It made a lot of man children on the internet very upset and angry because they thought that women were ruining their childhoods. I saw this 11 times in the cinema, and I took 100 people with me to watch it. So there is still some poor data scientist at the Odeon who doesn't understand why it ran for 15 weeks at Leicester Square. But turns out if you fill the cinema every week, then it runs for another week. So this is another great team that's got very, very different capabilities. Train your managers to spot biased feedback, and then figure out how to give the pushback to the person who gave that biased feedback and educate them on how to do better. But also don't forget to give the kernel of that feedback to the employee. So you shouldn't just pass on biased feedback, but you should make sure that you're capturing the most useful thing out of it, and then make sure that that they still get that input. And then when you're doing calibrations, which is a process where you talk about everybody in the organization and make sure that we're investing in them correctly based on their performance and their potential, make sure that you run those in a way that spots the people who might be a bit more introverted, a bit more quiet, a bit different in how they interact, a bit less likely to be understood, and make sure that you protect them from that when you're talking about them. I think you probably all know to value the what over the how. People don't often need telling exactly what to do or how to do it, but helping them achieve what they're trying to achieve their own way is really powerful. And so learn and practice and use coaching skills, which is where you help somebody figure out what they want to achieve and how they want to achieve it, rather than just giving them advice or giving them instruction. And then the other thing that I think really helps with people who are neurodiverse is we tend to have a very strong sense of justice and a strong sense of fairness. And so if you give somebody who's neurodiverse advice, which is basically like steal more pie, do right for you, look out for number one, that tends to go down very badly. It's not advice that we're comfortable taking. And so give more altruistic advice. Give advice that's about making the pie bigger for everybody rather than stealing more of the pie yourself. And this helps not just with neurodiverse folks, but it also helps with less individualistic cultures like those in the Far East, some of those in Latin America. When I was at P&G, I ran the summer internship program, and we used to have a very slick sales guy who would do the kind of talk to everybody that you meet because you never know who could be useful to you kind of message. And that didn't go down so great. And we found the year that we changed it to talk to everybody you can, because you're going to become an expert in these 10, 12 weeks, and you never know who you could help, made it much more likely that people from a broad range of backgrounds succeeded. And then remember that particularly in tech, under-index groups, so groups that are underrepresented, are chronically over-mentored and under-sponsored. It's great to be a mentor, it's great to give advice, but if you give somebody advice they can't follow because they're different enough from you that people will react differently to them doing the thing that you did, then it's not super helpful. This is a great article from Lara Hogan about what sponsorship looks like. Sponsorship is when you help somebody when they're not in the room. It's advocating for them, getting them opportunities, making sure that they're treated fairly, making sure that they get equal opportunities as other people, rather than just giving them advice one-to-one, which is more what mentoring is. And as I say, I'm not down on mentoring. I think mentoring is a great thing to do, but there are times when what people really need is sponsoring. And so when you think about this question, can I be myself and be successful? And think about it on behalf of a neurodiverse person. Think about whether there's any role models for them in the organization. Do they have to change who they are to succeed, or is there someone like them at the top? Are there multiple visible routes to success? So sometimes, I'll be honest, like the joke earlier about being the one the Daily Mail warned you about, I have not found many mentors or role models who ticked all the same boxes as me, who were different in all the same ways as me, right? But there's a big difference between places where the leadership look like they're wearing matching underwear to go with their matching ties and matching haircuts, and the kind of places where there's lots of different ways to succeed, right? Think about how much time people feel like they have to pretend or pass, and then think about whether your processes are really fair and combating bias as well. One of my fundamental beliefs in life is that everybody wants to be good at what they do. I don't think anybody wakes up in the morning thinking, today I'm aiming just south of mediocre, and if I can mess everybody else up along the way, my day will be perfect. I just don't think people are wired that way. And so I think, trust that people want to be good at what they're doing, and then figure out what's in their way and try to break down those barriers. So a quick reminder of what we talked about. 3 questions. Am I expected here? Am I respected here? Can I be myself and be successful here? Just a quick reminder of what that looks like in terms of like a checklist, which I've included more for people to look back on afterwards. And as I said, I'll share the slides. And then I think the most important message I have today is figure out how to be more than just an ally. Figure out how to be an accomplice. How do you help people really, really succeed in their roles? And how do you reduce the barriers for people with neurodiversity to really succeed and to do really, really well? That's it from me, and happy to move on to questions.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you so much for obviously giving that fantastic insight. I've definitely learned a lot, so I'm sure everyone has, and there's something we can definitely all act on, or start reflecting on when we're in the workplace and going about our normal lives. So yeah, thank you for that. We do have a question within the chat, but I'm sure that there may be some more coming in, which is really good. So the first one is, do you have any cheat codes for the interviewer on how to create conditions for neurodiverse interviewee to make them feel more comfortable?
It's a great question. Thank you for the question, Phil. I think the things you're most likely to notice if somebody is neurodiverse but they haven't disclosed it might be that they are struggling with eye contact. So don't do this thing that people do sometimes where they try and catch someone's eye. Just accept that maybe they're going to struggle with eye contact, and don't judge them for it. The second thing that I think you can do is know that quite a lot of people with neurodiversity have auditory processing challenges, and so it might look like they haven't heard you for a second, and then their brains catch up, and then they've heard your question. So if they pause for a second before answering you, or if they ask you to repeat the question, don't make them feel stupid or silly for doing that. I think it can really help them feel more comfortable if you just go, sure, do you want me to repeat it, or would you like me to ask it a different way? Because I think sometimes people will ask for a repeat because they haven't heard, and sometimes it's because they don't understand. And so ask that question of, do you want just a repeat, or do you want like an alternative phrasing? And then I think the other thing that you can do is just be very open that you value difference, and ask people what would make them most comfortable. I think if you're lucky, you get to ask that question about whether somebody needs any reasonable adjustments or any help at the interview process beforehand. And it's a good thing to build into your talent team and your recruiters to get them to kind of ask the question somewhere along the way, so that somebody doesn't have to always, fess up almost, or out themselves. Somebody might be more likely to say, yeah, I could do with some help on this test, or on please tell the interviewer that sometimes it takes me a moment to hear their question, and so I'm not being rude if it just takes me a second. Those kind of things can be really helpful. But yeah, this is something that I think you get better at over time with more interactions with people. And I think the golden rule is, there's this thing called the golden rule, which is treat others as you want to be treated. And the platinum rule is treat others as they want to be treated. And so, like, worst case, if you think there's a weird vibe or, it just doesn't seem to be gelling well in the interview, then it's okay to stop and just say, hey, I'm worried that you don't seem super comfortable. Is there anything I can do to make this easier for you? And I think then that just opens up the door for someone to say if there's something specific that they could benefit from.
Amazing. Yeah, definitely. And I guess if we start implementing, like, making that in a comfortable environment from the beginning, and like you said, addressing that you can raise anything that will make it a bit easier, that would definitely help for sure. We have got another question that's just come in. So this one says, hi, I am neurodiverse and also the only female in my tech team. How would you say I should go about suggesting new ideas for my team, as I often get pushback?
Yeah. I think it's tough to have those intersections. To be the only woman in the team and neurodiverse is especially tough. I would take the person who you respect the most in the team and watch how they do things and see if there's anything different. And if there isn't anything different, then I would go to them for advice on why you're getting pushback when they aren't. Because sometimes what you need is somebody to be an ally or an accomplice to you. There's a really fascinating article from the second Obama administration where a bunch of women found that they were just not being heard. What they said wouldn't be listened to. Then some man would say the same thing and suddenly it was a great idea when it hadn't been listened to at all when it was their idea. And they started echoing each other. So if a woman said something that wasn't kind of picked up by the rest of the people in the meeting, or it was ignored, or somebody else then restated their idea as their own, then one of the other women would go, how is that different to what so-and-so said earlier? Or would say, as Gemma said earlier, I think blah 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 was a great idea. And so there are ways to almost like weaponize your colleagues to help you as well. I hope that helps a bit, but it is a tough situation because you never know whether it's your gender or your neurodiversity that's getting in the way more. But try to find an ally who will be an accomplice and then work with them on it is the main thing I'd say.
Amazing. Yeah, thank you for that. And obviously, thank you for sharing that question as well. The third question that we've got is, I am a neurodivergent executive coach and clinical psychologist who specializes with people who are neurodivergent and organizations who are requesting assistance with team members who are neurodivergent. Do you have any suggestions or key points that will help people self-identify a need for assistance prior to concerns compounding? So prior to it happening?
Yeah, so I think the main thing that people start to notice is that certain things are very easy for them and certain things are much harder for them than for other people. And so that's the one side. The other side is actually the early signs of burnout, because sadly one of the things that happens to a lot of folks with neurodivergence, as you'll know, is that we burn out. We work very, very hard a lot of the time, and we are expending all this extra energy to fit in as well. And so I think helping people to spot the signs of burnout earlier is something that can be really helpful. I also think that something that's helped in my organization a lot is to have what we call active communities or employee resource groups, where there's a Slack channel and everybody who's neurodiverse is part of it, and they ask each other questions and ask for advice and say, hey, I found this new app that's really helping me focus. Maybe the other folks with ADHD would like to try it as well, or those kind of things. And so finding a sense of community can really help as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's really important, actually, that kind of safe space or a different way of bringing that together. Yeah, thank you for that one. So another one that we've got is, how did you get so confident in advocating yourself and others?
So the honest answer is I knew I was gay very young, and I was in a very, very hostile environment. I was in apartheid South Africa where it was illegal, and the army was openly experimenting on gay people, and all sorts of crazy shit was happening. And I just decided very young not to hide. And then when I became disabled, when I only found out I was neurodiverse in 2019, so 5 years ago, a lot of the stuff that I'd learned from being LGBT and trying to advocate for myself and my colleagues at work from an LGBT perspective was super helpful for disability and for neurodiversity. And now that I'm in C-level roles, I feel like it's partly my responsibility to advocate, because I'm the most senior neurodiverse person in the company. It's on me to make sure that we create a better environment for everybody else as well.
Amazing. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. It's definitely really important, so thank you. The next one we have is so this person said, thanks for the presentation. I have a personal question. So being ADHD is a big challenge because it prevents me from finishing tasks on time, and also people with ADHD can get bored easily if they don't find the task interesting. Oh, it's just disappeared. Sorry, 2 seconds. What do you think a person with ADHD, what do you think a person can do with ADHD to help improve their communication skills, which is obviously a mandatory part of being a leader?
Mm-hmm. So I think it's very true that if you're ADHD, then importance doesn't matter for how your brain prioritizes things. My personal approach has been that for my brain, urgency does matter. And so I operate very well with deadlines, and will find a way to get things done by the deadline, because that sense of urgency motivates me. And so that's my personal hack for it, is that I, rather than caring about what's most important, I just care about what's most urgent. And then I try to organize my work so that the most urgent things are also important things. So I'm not, frantically doing my expenses at 11 p.m. at night just because they're due. I'm doing the most important thing. It's like called structured procrastination sometimes, where you're not doing the thing you should be doing, but you're doing the next most important thing rather than the least important thing. And so that's one thing. And then I think on improving communication skills, the main thing I've done is I started making like bullet point lists on Post-it notes. So if I had to communicate clearly, I would just accept that I would probably ramble a bit if I didn't script myself somewhat. And so I started to make notes, and then to take 10 minutes before all hands or whatever, and make sure that I had written stuff down. But I think it depends on what your challenge is with communication. If it's being clear and concise, it's a different thing to address than if you get stressed out because you're standing in front of people, right? So it depends a little bit on the further detail, I think. But I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's actually just reminded me of something we discussed recently within our company, is the difference between like knowing what's urgent and knowing what's important, like you've just discussed then, because sometimes this can be quite blurred, and then it does get a bit overwhelming. So yeah, breaking that down is definitely something I look at as well. So yeah, that's really, really interesting. Thank you. So we've got 2 more questions left. This one is, are you aware of any companies specifically looking for neurodiversity talent for our special abilities? Or are there any companies simply accommodating us if needed?
I think there's a range. So SAP very famously had an entire program for hiring people who were autistic at one point, and they really leaned into what the kind of superpowers of the folks with those roles were, and they designed the roles around those capabilities. So if you're autistic, you're maybe less likely, you're going to be quite pleased with routine rather than bored by it. You're going to be reassured by structure rather than constrained by it, and that kind of thing. But I think that there's a fine line between accommodating or designing for people, and then the risk being that you might stereotype them a little bit. But yeah, I think that there's a range. At Pleo, I'm actively trying to find people who are different than who I've got already, because I think that adds to the team. We've got pretty good neurodiversity representation, pretty good LGBTQ representation, but not as great from a race point of view, for instance. And so I'm doing a lot more connecting with, Black Girl Tech and places like that to make sure that we build those relationships with the community. But I think a lot of it, honestly, is often more at the individual hiring manager level than at the company level these days. I do think that neurodiversity is like the next frontier of DEI. And so we're starting to see more people caring about it and more people caring for it. And there are some organizations, particularly around autism, that are focused on, trying to make jobs happen for folks who maybe otherwise wouldn't be able to work. But a lot of the charitable work tends to go, honestly, on folks who are very severely affected rather than folks who can hold down a job, for instance. And so, if you can hold down a job and you've got ADHD or autism or both, or Tourette's, or I'm glossing over the fact there's a lot more to neurodiversity than just ADHD and autism. It's just my perspective, right? But I think that you want to, we tend to be regarded as like low support needs or high functioning. Those terms are both used. I don't love the high functioning one, but I think that there then tends to be a little less help for folks who are regarded as not needing as much support, when actually maybe day to day we do need some support at work. So yeah.
Amazing. Yeah, thank you. And then the final one that we've got for you is, as a support service provider for neurodiverse people, how can I help people feel more comfortable accessing services available for them? A lot of people I work with are afraid of managers knowing or finding out about their difficulties.
Yeah, and I think that's very fair. There are definitely managers who cope badly with that knowledge and treat people poorly as a result of it. The main thing that I found that's helped is, as I mentioned earlier, having these kind of active communities or ERGs, and then sharing the information through those. So it's not coming from the top down through their managers. It's coming from their peers saying, "Hey, I found this really useful. I found that really useful." And Amal, I'm super interested in what you offer. So if you could add me on LinkedIn, I'd like to chat to you about what kind of support services you provide, because we're looking at doing more for our team internally.
Perfect. Yeah, definitely.
I think there are a couple of questions in the chat, but I don't know if we want to take them as well.
Let's have a little look.
I think one's already been asked. The one about neurodiverse talent.
Just interview someone.
How do you soothe somebody who's struggling in an interview situation? I think acknowledging that they seem to be struggling and saying, do you need to take a second, can be really helpful to just help people breathe and take a moment. But it is difficult when somebody is kind of reacting weirdly because of the stress of the interview situation, or differently because of the way that their brain is going faster than they can talk. Sometimes you want to just give them an opportunity to time out and say, do you need to take a second to gather your thoughts, or do you want to write something down for a second so that you can structure yourself, or those kind of things can be helpful as well. It's obviously a lot easier if they've disclosed to you that they're neurodiverse, and then you can be more helpful to them by acknowledging it. If you're just sort of assuming that they are, it can be more difficult. But I hope that helps.
Perfect, thank you. Can you see any more at all, Meri?
Don't think so. I think we're good.
I think we've covered them all. Amazing. Well, yeah, thank you again so much for obviously that insight, and also for sharing your personal story and point of view as well with us. So thank you for that. We are going to post all links, our website link, a link to your LinkedIn within the chat as well. So please, yeah, give us a follow, reach out to Meri as well. And it's been really good to have you all here today, and really lovely to see so many people getting together for this. So thank you again for that.
Cool. Thank you all very much. And I've just posted the slides in the chat as well if anybody wants them. Please just keep them, with my banner on them so people know that they're mine. That's my only ask.
Absolutely. Amazing. Thank
Cool.
you so much, everyone. Have a great evening.
Thanks, Gemma.
Thank you. Bye.